essentially, I'm trained in psychology. Call me a behaviour change practitioner if you like. And it's my job to look at the psychological drivers and barriers behind decision-making, which are often invisible. So you've probably heard about the behavioural economics revolution, which is really just a rebranding of psychology to put it back into the forefront. So my job would have been prevalent in the 1930s in advertising agencies. You would have seen psychologists in Mad Men. It would have disappeared over the past 50 years. And then over the past 10 years, there's been a big resurgence of bringing this kind of thinking back into the agency. And what's been fascinating this morning is actually, for me this morning's been a really good conversation on the psychological drivers and barriers on on affecting bringing in value-based pricing. Actually, what's been talked about a lot is not so much the mechanisms of what it is, but more about the hidden barriers to bringing it in. And for me, that's one of the most important parts. It feels like we're at a part of a journey now when we know kind of what is the solution, but it's just figuring out how we actually implement it, which is really, really hard. And I was speaking to Tom last Wednesday, and we were talking about it's kind of the cobbler's children syndrome, where the best shoemaker in the town, his children wore the worst shoes. We're not very good at implementing what we do to the outside world, to ourselves. And actually, by looking inwards towards what the agencies can do, we can actually look at using those skills to make it better. I just want to start off with a quick fact, just because talking at an IPA conference on finance and a commercial agenda, just to show you how complex, this is what interested me when I first learned about psychology initially, how complex the whole thing is. So when we talk about some simple, small ideas over the next 15 minutes, I just want you to know that it comes from a really, really complex piece of hardware. So the brain, there are more connections in your brain than there are known stars in our galaxy. So there's 100 billion connections between the cells in your brain. That makes us an incredibly complex set of species. Then think about times and squaring that number by all the people in this room and then by all the clients. And actually, decision making is incredibly complicated. And there's no wonder that we don't have to rely on some mental shortcuts and some rule of thumb that we've evolved to make these decisions easier in order to make those decisions. So what I'm saying is, it's an incredibly complex field when you look at the psychology of decision making. And we actually rely on a key set of heuristics, if you like, to get us through that. And actually knowing about those can help us make better decisions and actually design situations, which is where the choice architecture comes in, design situations so people naturally take the right choice rather than the one we're already taking. Essentially, I'm going to take a couple of Tim's concepts and go a little bit deeper now from a psychological point of view. But there's actually something really, really fascinating. This is actually a picture, just so you believe I'm an actual psychologist, this is a picture of my brain. You can tell it's my brain because of the big nose that sticks out on the side over there. So authentic talk happening right now. One quick question. When you go into a restaurant and the waiter says to you, "Would you like any water for the table?" What do you say? You have these two options. You have yes, and you have no. If the waiter says to you, "Would you like still or sparkling?" that's a choice within the yes category. So no is off the table. You're then 210% more likely to say yes to water than if you were with the choice on the right than the choice on the left. So those kind of 10 words at the top there have a fundamental impact on what you choose. Now, it might seem a pithy example to tell you about water, but actually, as you can see from some of the things that Tim was saying earlier and some of the things I'm about to talk about now, some of these principles are baked in at a very, very deep level in our brains and can work. So you can scale up some of these ideas and still have an impact. And we can't ignore these things. This is what the field calls placebo choice. Again, talking about the rules of three, just a quick example here. So when Tim was talking about putting 3 choices in front of people, coffee shops, Starbucks, Costa have all found that actually the middle choice is always the most popular one. Even if you take small off the menu, like Starbucks have, and then your middle choice is the large, so you go medium, large, extra large, people still gravitate towards the middle choice. So there's this really, really deep ingrained thing. It's called extremeness aversion. We don't like to be on the edges of things. We don't like to pay the most. We don't like to pay the least. It feels normal to be within the middle. So if you do this with an airline, if an airline presents you with just the economy seats when you ask for the economy price, then you get quite a simple choice architecture here, and it's quite easy to make your choice. If they give you economy, premium economy, and business class, so this is Heathrow to JFK right now, you will see that actually It's very, very expensive for business class compared to economy. So not many people actually nudge up from economy to premium economy or premium economy to business class, about 0.1% of people. But what's actually happening here is a very simple psychological principle of relative framing. More people are likely to buy the economy price simply because a big number next to a small number makes a small number feel smaller psychologically, and you're more likely to purchase it. You'll actually see another amazing deal that if you are thinking about going to New York today, it's £1 cheaper on the 9:45 flight for business class than it is the rest. So an absolute bargain there. There's a piece of relative framing in action. What I want to talk to you about, and many of you will be familiar with these concepts in the room, so I'm just going to go very, very quickly over them, but the idea that you actually have two brains inside your head, not one. And the trap that we will all fall into in this room, I think, is thinking that actually big agency price decisions are made with one half of the brain and kind of small decisions like buying water are made with the other. But I don't think it's the case, and the research doesn't show that. So if you go up your spine where the spine meets the brain at the back, you get to the oldest part of the brain, the limbic system, the reptilian system, the automatic parts of the brain, and that's what psychologists would call system 1. It's about the size of your fist, right at the back here. Eventually, we evolved on top of that system 2, which is our conscious part of our brain, where we think. So that's kind of on top at the top, and it's where you have that small voice inside your head and where you do complex maths. We characterize them as Homer Simpson and Captain Spock, not because Homer Simpson's stupid, but actually because he makes a lot of very quick decisions. It's actually very good that we have this part of our brain as this kind of autopilot to keep us going, because it would actually be very, very exhausting if we had to do all the calculations throughout the day. So the system 1 thinking on the left there, automatic, is uncontrolled, effortless, emotional, fast, and unconscious. And then the more of the reflective stuff over here, system 2, that kind of thinking is controlled, effortful, deductive, slow, and self-aware. So when I'm speaking in English now, it's coming out quite smoothly because it's my first language, and I've done this slide before. If I was to do this slide in German, which is my second language, I'm not very practiced in that language, but I could probably get through this slide and a couple of the others. But I'll be thinking very, very consciously about making those actions. Taking the daily commute, if you go to the same office every single day, use your Homer Simpson brain to do it. If you are going to a different office for the first time or a different venue, you'd be using your reflective brain to do it. Now, the interesting thing about this is the research shows that 95% of your decision-making is done by the brain on the right-hand side, the automatic brain, every single day, and only 5% on the reflective side. This is the key point, which I don't think is often brought out saliently enough, which is that it's not that some decisions are made over here and some decisions are made over there. It's actually that every decision that you make is actually governed by those proportions. So anything that you do, any action that you take, is 95% governed by your automatic brain and then 5% governed by the rational brain. So Rory Sutherland, who's the head of Ogilvy Change, the founder of Ogilvy Change, talks about it in this way, which is actually Homer Simpson is like the Oval Office and Captain Spock is like the press office. Captain Spock thinks he's making all the decisions, but actually is post-rationalizing decisions already made by the people who are actually making the decision-making. Homer Simpson makes the decisions, then we post-rationalize it. And that ladders up too. So when you go to buy a house, the smell of the house is something that would attract Homer Simpson. It would be subconsciously affecting your decision to purchase. But Captain Spock's unaware of that, but is actually influenced by that. So what I'm saying is, even when it comes to really, really big decisions about price, and even when they're governed by procurement processes, we would be mad to think that actually it's an absolutely rational decision process and that there is no subconscious cues made there. And also when you think about rolling out value-based pricing into your agencies, it would be mad to think that 95% of the decisions that are going through people's heads and the factors that affect that are actually not automatic. And it's actually, if we're wanting to put value-based businesses and start it in a brain-friendly way, we're going to have to take into attention these psychological barriers and drivers that affect the Homer Simpson brain as well as the Captain Spock brain. But the default is always to think about the rational levers, and actually it's only a small part of the decision-making. So over the past 2 weeks, alongside the IPA, we've been working on picking out 5 of the most interesting principles to present to you, to then have a small presentation on the application. But I really hope that actually you'll be able to take the principles that are presented here and apply them in much more interesting ways going forwards and things that are more relevant to you. Some of them you'll be familiar with, and some of them I think will be brand new. So social norms, this is the psychological principle that most people are familiar with, the idea that we like to do what people like ourselves do, or rather we hate to do things that people like ourselves aren't doing. Being the first is really, really hard. Social norms is part of the problem as well as part of the solution. So the idea here that actually our brains don't make decisions in isolation. We use other people's brains to help our decision-making forward. It makes us feel safer doing something if other people are doing it. Now, there's a really big watch out here with how we talk about value-based pricing. This is an amazing example about the Petrified Forest National Park. So they had a huge problem. So obviously very, very valuable objects that are inside this park. And there's a big problem with people stealing them. So and obviously they tried to put up a sign which makes it sound like that it's a bad thing to steal, and it basically said lots of people are stealing from this forest. If you carry on stealing at this rate, we're going to have no attraction left for you to see. Please stop stealing. It sounds like, oh my God, we're going to be losing out on this amazing attraction. We best stop this behavior. That was the intention. But actually, implicitly within that statement was telling you that everybody is actually stealing the wood, and that if you don't take it now, you're going to lose out. So essentially, you get to a rate where when that sign was put up, actually there was an increase in the amount of wood that was stolen. Social norms used incredibly poorly. You need to point out the behavior, the desired behavior, not the behavior you want to stop. You've got to point the social norm in the right way. So basically, when they simply changed it to basically pointing out that that most people who visit the park are respectful and actually don't steal, please don't steal as well, you actually see a huge reduction in the amount of wood that's stolen just by pointing the norm in the right direction. So we were talking about this, and we thought that actually there's going to be a real problem with bringing in a new order of thing. Yes, there are lots of great examples of value-based pricing already, but it's definitely not mainstream yet. And if we are talking internally to the people in our agencies about saying there's this new thing, and no one's really tried yet, and we're going to start it out. Actually, we might be pointing the norm in the wrong way. When we talk about this, we want to be talking about the amazing examples that have happened already and how we're halfway there. We want to be telling people that it is something that is being done and is really successful for those people in the right situations. So pointing the norm in the right way is really, really important. The second one as well, slightly smaller principle, I think, but a really, really key. We're going to tell people what other people are doing. We're going to make sure that we've got the details right. So for this one, the messenger effect, the idea that who communicates the information is as important as what the communication is. It's really, really key. We think far too long about what we're saying and not enough time thinking about who's saying it. In this example here, you're 210% more likely to cross the road at a red light if a man in a suit does it first rather than a man in a tracksuit. It's exactly the same piece of information, but in fact, you have a very, very different behavior on the back of it. So there are obviously a lot of applications to this. We just thought quite quickly about this one. But can your client become an advocate of the approach? It is our responsibility, it is the seller's responsibility to get value-based pricing out there. But can we think really, really tightly, and lots of other situations apart from this one as well, about who is saying the information and at what time, because that will be really, really key. Might feel like a small detail, but a lot of the psychological barriers always do feel small, but they actually have a big effect or can hold you back in a big way. The third one is scarcity bias. This one, for me, is a really, really interesting one about the idea that we naturally value things. We've evolved to naturally value things that we perceive there is less of. It's an interesting one. We had an interesting conversation around this. In this situation, there was an experiment done in a supermarket selling tin soup. You could just purchase the soup normally, and you get an average rate of about, I think it was about 2.4 soups being sold per shopper. If you have no limit, there's a 3.3 soup can distribution. If the supermarket says maximum 4 per customer, the sales of soups increases to 3.5. If it says maximum 12 per customer, you have an increase to 7 soups sold per customer. So nothing has changed about the soup, and the price of the soup hasn't changed either. You've simply added some scarcity to the situation, which changes the psychological value of the product. So this is one of those interesting things where, when it comes to value-based pricing, you really want to be thinking about how can you limit it when it's first being brought out. Can you do one per client, one per situation? Can you make it feel like a scarce new thing? If it's in the seller's hands to change the behavior, can we be using some of these principles to make it feel like a really, really valuable thing, which is rolled out slowly? This is just a really nice example of how deeply ingrained scarcity and our sense of fairness is within us.
The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber.
Value-based pricing on the left, cost on the right, or the C word, as we like to call it at Ogilvy Change, cost. This one, I would like to ask the audience, how many of you have heard of the risky shift? One person? As a psychologist, it's quite scary to think that you can run a business without knowing about this principle. You can't fly a plane without knowing about this principle. You can't fly a Cessna from Shoreham without knowing about the risky shift. So, an amazing parallel to make. Just as a psychologist looking at decision-making, aviation have it nailed. They have really, really analysed every single time a decision has gone wrong and looked at the choice architecture of the situation and redesigned it so that mistake can't happen again. The risky shift is essentially this. So when you're in a cockpit, you're flying over Toronto, what used to be said is about the decision to land in bad weather. The pilot would say something like, the weather in Toronto is marginal, Jim. Do you think we should land? And then you have a conversation together and you have a diffusion of responsibility. So on the cockpit recorder, essentially, the blame will go on both people. So not just on one person. That's what's known as a risky shift. Pairs of people make more risky decisions than if the responsibility is isolated. In about the 1980s, 1990s, legislation was brought in to overcome the risky shift in the cockpit. They now say, the weather in Toronto is marginal, Jim. I'm diverting. Do you agree? So there's a default position in there, which the person then has to opt out of. The co-pilot have to disagree rather than just go along with it and see where it goes. There is an isolation. There's a heaviness of the responsibility of the feedback loop of the decision on one of the pilots rather than across two. Now, the risky shift is really, really interesting because actually, when you think about how value-based pricing will actually be implemented within agencies, we've got to really think cleverly, and I think the Pricing Council nails it. Have to really think cleverly about how you diffuse the responsibility on bringing in the new order of thing. Do you want to blame just one person if one scenario goes wrong, or do you want to make sure it's spread over a council? There's an interesting dynamic. Someone was saying to me the other day when I was taking through the slides, they were saying, well, actually, we've read a lot of research about groups actually come to much safer decisions and are very risk-averse. So I went back to literature. And actually, kind of what the research that I was finding was that actually pairs make very risky decisions together, and kind of councils of above 8 the curve starts to become a lot risk-averse at that point. So actually thinking about, this might seem like a small point, but thinking about who thinks about value-based pricing and in what context is really, really important to the rollout. If you want riskier decisions, or if you want people to be braver and more bolder in trying a new order of thing, you have to think about the context in which those people are making those decisions. The Pricing Council for me is also really important. It's talking about diversity. It's talking about getting different types of thinkers in that panel. Rory Sutherland, who I work for, has an amazing analogy for this, in my opinion, which is rational people creative people always have to run their ideas past a rational person before they get out the door. But a rational person never has to run their ideas past a creative person before they go out the door. Imagine the amount of value we can create just by using the resources in the agencies that we have to actually think more creatively about how we run new order of things. And then finally, this is one that Tim touched on really, really well, which is the Sapirwhorf hypothesis. That's the fancy psychological word for new language creates new norms. So those of you that know about designated driver, it feels like it was a concept for about the past 100 years. It wasn't. It was invented by an ad agency in Canada. And essentially, they wrote the word and the concept designated driver into film scripts, soap scripts, magazines, kind of very, very natural PR pieces. And the language took off straight away, and it felt like something that had been around for a long time. The interesting thing about that is now when people are actually going for drinks with their friends, they have a piece of language that they can use to talk to each other about this new behaviour that they're doing, which gives them permission to do it. And just as a provocation, and just as one to end with, really, it just feels like, as Tim was saying, changing the language is so important, and making it stick is really, really important too. But is there even a new term for value-based pricing? Does that have baggage already? Does that feel like we're trying to get one over on the clients by raising our prices? Can we think about very, very tightly and forensically about the language that we use, because we know it has a huge impact on the behaviour and the behaviour of our clients? So I don't know what the answer to that one is, but I think it's a really, really interesting question to ask. So I just want to say, I mean, I was talking to Tom about this earlier. He was saying it'd be amazing if the people in this room probably have some ideas already. So if you do have some ideas, and perhaps they're read out later in the day, but if you have any ideas about what could the new term for value-based pricing be, just tweet them now to Ogilvy Change, so at Ogilvy Change, and we'll read them out later on. It'd be really, really interesting to see where we get to with that one. So I just want to say thank you. I think that, I would think this, wouldn't I, but psychology has a really, really key role to all of this and how we actually roll it out. It feels like we've figured out what the answer is, but actually the next 3 years in this debate will be how do you actually get it right within the agency? How do you actually change people's decision-making to change our clients' decision-making? So thinking about those in a really, really deep and meaningful way is really, really important. Essentially, we have this bias within us, which is the biggest bias, which is that a big problem needs a big solution. But actually, what all the field will tell you, of the field of social psychology, behavioural economics, tell you that actually there's an incongruence there, that small ideas can have a big effect. So actually, it's really worth thinking about getting the details right so the rest of it will actually follow on. So here's a reading list if anybody wants one, and thank you very much.